There is a story that circulates in the corners of the internet where old maps and older grudges live together, and it goes like this. Sometime in the 1880s, a government ethnologist named James Mooney sat down with Choctaw elders in the Indian Territory, and they told him something he was not prepared to hear. They told him the ridges were hollow. Not caves, not sinkholes, not the ordinary crumbling of limestone under rain, but hollow in the way a house is hollow, with rooms and passages and floors that had been made rather than worn. They told him the hollows were older than the Choctaw arrival in that country, older than the removal that had carried them there, and that whoever had made them had gone away long before the first Choctaw foot crossed the Mississippi. And then, the story says, the document that recorded all this went quiet. It was not published. It was not indexed. It sits, if it sits anywhere, in a box in a federal archive, uncatalogued, waiting. That is the story. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. It has been told in 100 videos and 1,000 comment threads, and every version of it carries the same emotional charge, which is the charge of a thing withheld. Someone knew. Someone wrote it down. Someone else decided you should not read it. I want to tell you what actually happened in those ridges, because the truth is stranger than the legend and considerably worse, and because it is not hidden at all, it is printed. It is in treaty texts and congressional acts and coroner reports and royalty ledgers. The ridges of southeastern Oklahoma really were hollowed out. That part is true. The hollowing happened within the living memory of the people who were marched there. It was done with black powder and picks and mules and the labor of men from 4 continents, and every ton that came out of those hollows was weighed, priced, and recorded, and the money went somewhere, and you can find out where. But before any of that, we have to deal with James Mooney, because the legend is built on his name, and the name will not hold the weight. James Mooney was a real man. He was born in Richmond, Indiana, in 1861, the son of Irish immigrants, and he had no formal training in anthropology because in his youth there was barely any such thing to be trained in. He taught himself. He compiled, as a young man, a list of every Indian tribe he could find reference to, working out of newspapers and library books, and he carried that list to Washington and talked his way into the Bureau of Ethnology, which had been founded in 1879 under John Wesley Powell. Mooney was hired in 1885. He spent the rest of his life in that building and in the field, and he became one of the most important and most complicated figures in the early American record of native life. Here is the problem for the legend. Mooney's fieldwork was Cherokee. He went to the Qualla boundary in western North Carolina in 1887, and he kept going back for years. He worked with a medicine man called Swimmer, whose name in Cherokee was Ayunini, and Swimmer kept a notebook of sacred formulas written in the Sequoia syllabary, and Mooney persuaded him to explain it. Out of that came the sacred formulas of the Cherokees, published in 1891, and Myths of the Cherokee, published in 1900. Later, Mooney worked among the Kiowa and the Plains nations and wrote the great study of the ghost dance. He was, in the small world of the Bureau, the Cherokee man and then the Plains man. He was not the Choctaw man. There is no Mooney Choctaw monograph. There is no Choctaw field notebook of his that scholars fight over. If you go looking for the document in which Choctaw elders describe hollow ridges to James Mooney in the 1880s, you will not find a citation, because there is no citation. There is only the shape of one. The story gives you a real name, a real decade, a real agency, and a real people, and it arranges them so they look like a footnote. It is a footnote with nothing under it. And I want to be careful here, because this is the part where a certain kind of video would say, aha, the absence proves the suppression. That move is the engine of the whole genre. Nothing found means something hidden. But absence is only evidence if you have first established that the thing should have been there, and nobody has ever established that. Mooney's papers were inventoried. His correspondence sits in the National Anthropological Archives. Scholars have gone through it for a century, looking for exactly the sort of unpublished material that would make a career, and the Choctaw Hollow Ridge account is not among the things anyone has found or fought about. So the document is a ghost. Fine. What about the ridges? Here the legend runs into a second problem, which is rock. If you want hollow ground in North America, you want limestone. Limestone dissolves. Rainwater picks up carbon dioxide from the air and from soil, becomes weakly acidic, and works down through joints and bedding planes over tens of thousands of years, widening them into passages. That is how you get Mammoth Cave in Kentucky and the Great Cave Country of Missouri and Tennessee, and it is why those states have thousands of mapped caves and a folk tradition of bottomless holes. Southeastern Oklahoma is not that country. The Ouachita Mountains, which run from central Arkansas west into Oklahoma, are built mostly of sandstone and shale. They are the eroded stumps of a mountain range raised roughly 300 million years ago when the ancestral North American and South American plates collided in the assembly of Pangaea. That collision did not push the rock straight up. It squeezed it sideways, folding the layers into long, parallel east-to-west ridges, which is why the Ouachitas run the wrong way compared to the Appalachians, and why a map of that country looks like corduroy. The hard sandstone beds stand up as ridges. The soft shale beds wear down into the valleys between them. Sandstone does not dissolve into cave systems. Shale certainly does not. You get rock shelters, which are overhangs where a soft layer has been undercut beneath a hard one, and southeastern Oklahoma has plenty of those, and people sheltered in them for thousands of years and left evidence of it. But an overhang is not a hollow ridge. Stand under one, and you are standing under a shelf, not inside a room. So, the geology says no natural hollows of the kind the story wants, and the paperwork says no Mooney document. By the ordinary rules of investigation, the story should be finished here, and if this were a debunking video, it would be. It is not a debunking video, because the ridges are hollow. They were made hollow on purpose by machinery and men, beginning in the 1870s and continuing for the better part of a century, and the reason the Choctaw are in this story at all is that they owned the ridges when the hollowing started, and they owned them in a way no other landholder in the United States has ever owned anything. To understand that, you have to go back to Mississippi. The Choctaw homeland was the country of central and southern Mississippi and parts of Alabama, a landscape of pine and cane and rich bottom soil, and the Choctaw were farmers there on a scale that surprised European observers who expected something else. They grew corn and beans and squash in quantity. They traded surplus. They had towns with formal governance and a division into districts under chiefs, and they had a mother mound, Naniwaya, in what is now Winston County, which stands in their tradition at the origin of the people. I am going to leave the mound country largely alone here, because the lost race stories that grew up around American earthworks in the 19th century are their own long argument, and I have made it elsewhere. The short version is that white settlement wanted very badly to believe that the mounds had been built by somebody else, some vanished superior race that the current occupants had displaced, because if the current occupants were themselves interlopers on stolen ground, then removing them was only history repeating itself. It was a comfortable idea, and it was wrong, and Cyrus Thomas of the same Bureau of Ethnology took it apart with excavation and publication in 1894. Note the shape of it, though, because you will see it again in this story. The Hollow Ridge legend is the mound builder myth wearing new clothes. It says someone else was here first, someone greater, someone gone, and it says this about ground that was taken from people who are not gone at all and who will tell you so. Now, in 1830 the Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, and within months, in September of that year, at a place called Dancing Rabbit Creek in Mississippi, the Choctaw signed the first major removal treaty under the new law. They ceded something on the order of 11 million acres, essentially the entire remaining homeland, in exchange for land in the Indian Territory west of Arkansas. The negotiation was not a negotiation in any sense you would recognize. Federal commissioners had excluded most observers. The alternative on the table was submission to Mississippi state law, which had just been extended over Choctaw country, and which stripped the tribal government of authority and made it a criminal offense to hold office under it. Sign and move, or stay and be a subject with no standing. Some signed. Some walked away. The treaty was ratified. The removal itself began in the winter of 1831 and continued in waves for years. It was badly provisioned and badly timed. Blizzards caught people on the road in Arkansas in the winter of 1831 and 1832. Cholera caught them the following year. Estimates of the dead vary and are all bad. Thousands died on the way and after arriving. A young French traveller named Alexis de Tocqueville watched a Choctaw crossing of the Mississippi at Memphis in the winter of 1831 and wrote about it afterward in a passage that has never lost its power, describing the silence of it, the dogs left howling on the bank, the absence of any sound of grief. He noted that the whole thing was being done with perfect legality and in the forms of philanthropy, and that this was the part he could not get past. The Choctaw were the first nation removed under the 1830 Act. Everything that happened to the Cherokee, the Muskogee, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole in the following decade followed a path the Choctaw had walked first. And here is the clause that this entire story turns on. The land they were given in the West was granted to the Choctaw Nation as a nation held in common, not allotted to individuals, not divided into farms with deeds. The nation held the title, and Choctaw citizens held use rights. If you cleared a field and built a house, the improvements were yours and you could sell them, but the ground under them was not yours to sell, because it belonged to everyone and to the nation as a legal person. Grazing, timber, water, and whatever might be under the ground were common property. The treaties also carried a promise, restated in that no state or territory would ever be erected over it without their consent. That promise was made because it was believed to be cheap. The government thought it was giving away a worthless wilderness. That belief was the moral engine of the entire removal. You are not stealing if what you take is valuable and what you give is not. So you tell yourself the exchange was fair and you make the promise generous, because generosity costs nothing when the object is thought to be nothing. The Choctaw rebuilt. They wrote a constitution. They set up districts and courts and a legislature that met at Tuskahoma. They founded schools, including academies that were among the better secondary schools in the region, and their literacy rates in the second half of the 19th century compared favorably with those of the surrounding states. They farmed, they ranched, they printed laws. It was not a reservation in the later sense, it was a country. Then somebody looked at the ground. The Wachita folding that made those long ridges also did something else. It cooked and squeezed the Pennsylvanian-age coal beds trapped in the layers, and pressure and heat are what turn ordinary coal into the hard, low, volatile, high-carbon coal that steel-making requires. Coking coal, the kind you bake into coke and feed into a blast furnace to reduce iron ore. In the second half of the 19th century, as American railroads and American steel were expanding at a rate that has no real parallel, coking coal was among the most valuable commodities on the continent, and there was not much of it west of the Mississippi. There was a great deal of it under the Choctaw Nation. The man who understood this first, or at least first in a way that mattered, was James Jackson McAllister. He was a young trader, and around 1870 he came into possession of the field notes of a geologist who had surveyed the area some years earlier and had recorded coal outcrops near the crossing of two old wagon roads, the Texas Road running north to south and the California Road running east to west. That crossing is where the city of McAllister, Oklahoma, stands today. McAllister did not have a way to legally own that coal. He was not a Choctaw citizen, and a non-citizen could not hold land in the nation, and there were no fee simple deeds to hold anyway. So he solved the problem the way it was frequently solved. In 1872 he married Rebecca Burney, a Chickasaw woman, and by that marriage he became an intermarried citizen with the use rights of a citizen. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it is one of those facts that reorganizes everything around it. In a country where land could not be bought, marriage was the mineral lease. The legal instrument that opened the coalfield was a wedding. The same year, 1872, the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway, the Katy, pushed its line south through the nation on its way to Texas. That is the other half of the equation. Coal in the ground is worth nothing. Coal on a rail siding is worth whatever the furnace will pay. The Katy arrived, the mines opened, and within a few years the ridges around McAllister and Krebs and Hartshorn were being opened along the seams. Now, because the Choctaw Nation held its land in common, and because the nation had a functioning legislature and courts, something happened next that almost never happened anywhere else in the American extraction story. The owners got paid. The Choctaw Nation asserted that the coal belonged to the nation, and it levied a royalty. Operators paid a set amount per ton mined, and the money went into the Choctaw Treasury, and the Treasury paid for schools and government. There were disputes about the rate and about collection and about who was entitled to mine at all, and at one point the conflict over McAllister's operations became sharp enough that he was arrested by Choctaw authorities and, by the account that has come down, came close to being executed under Choctaw law before the matter was resolved and a royalty arrangement settled. He later became a Choctaw official himself and eventually lieutenant governor of the state of Oklahoma, which tells you how the story ended for him personally. But for a window of roughly 25 years, the thing that almost never happens was happening. An indigenous nation held title to a world-class mineral deposit, taxed its extraction, and spent the proceeds on its own citizens. That window is the most interesting economic fact in this entire region, and it is the reason everything that follows had to be done through law rather than through violence. You cannot simply take the coal. The title is good. The title was written by the United States itself and ratified by the Senate, so the title has to be changed. Hold that thought while we go into the ridges, because the physical hollowing was happening at the same time. The mines of the Choctaw coalfield were not open pits. The seams dipped into the folded ridges, and the method was underground, mostly room and pillar. You drive an entry into the hillside along the seam. Off that entry you cut side passages, and off those you open rooms, and between the rooms you leave pillars of unmined coal standing to hold up the roof. The result, in plan view, looks like a street grid. That is the standard method, and it is why so much of the American underground looks like a buried town when you see it drawn. Not because a town is buried there, because holding up a ceiling with columns is the same problem whether you are building a temple or emptying a hill. The men who did this were from everywhere. The coal towns of the Choctaw Nation drew Italian miners in such numbers that Krebs became and remains a center of Italian-American culture in Oklahoma, with restaurants still operating that trace back to those families. There were Welsh miners who brought technique, Poles, Lithuanians, Russians, Hungarians, Slovaks, Mexican miners, black miners, some of them Choctaw freedmen, some of them arrivals from the collapsing labor market of the post-war South. They lived in company houses, bought at company stores, and were often paid in scrip, which is to say in money that only spends in one place. That is a device worth pausing on, because it explains a great deal about what the ridges did to the people who emptied them. If your wage is paid in a currency redeemable only at your employer's store, then your employer sets your wage twice. Once when he hires you, and again every time you buy flour. The wage and the debt are the same ledger, written by the same hand. Miners in the Choctaw Nation, as in Pennsylvania and Tennessee and Colorado, fought about this constantly, and it is one of the reasons the United Mine Workers organized in the territory early and hard, and one of the reasons those strikes turned bitter, and now the specific mechanism that makes the ridges genuinely hollow rather than merely mined. Room and pillar mining leaves a large fraction of the coal in the ground, standing in the pillars. That is expensive. It is coal you have paid to reach and cannot sell. So when a section is worked out and the company is preparing to abandon it, the crews go back in and rob the pillars. They cut into the standing columns from the retreating face, taking as much as they dare, working backward toward the entry, and behind them the roof comes down. It is deliberate. You are trading the room for the last of the coal, and you are betting that you can walk out faster than the mountain can fall. That is the hollowing. Not a chamber found, a chamber made, sold by the ton, and then dropped. Men died doing it, constantly, in ones and twos, in roof falls that made the county paper if they made anything, and then, occasionally, in numbers. On the 7th of January in 1892, at the Osage Coal and Mining Company's mine number 11 at Krebs, a blast ignited coal dust and gas underground. Coal dust is the thing that turns an accident into a catastrophe. A small ignition raises dust off the ribs and floor, the dust catches, the flame front races ahead of itself along the passages, and the explosion feeds on the mine. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The Krebs disaster killed something close to 100 men and injured many more. Some accounts put the dead higher. Survivors and rescuers described conditions afterward that do not need embellishing, including the practice, in the immediate aftermath, of hauling injured men out and laying them along the ground while the fires were still being fought. It was, and remains, one of the worst mining disasters in the history of that country. There was no federal mine safety agency at the time, because the Bureau of Mines would not exist until 1910, created after the middle of that decade's run of American disasters made the arithmetic impossible to ignore. There was no workers' compensation. There was a coroner's inquest, and there were company statements, and there were funerals in 5 languages. If you want a sealed chamber under a ridge in southeastern Oklahoma with men inside it, that is where it is. It is not a mystery. It has a date and a company name and a list. So the ridges were being emptied, and the nation was being paid a royalty on the emptying, and the schools were being funded by it, and the arrangement was intolerable to a large number of people who wanted the coal and could not have it on those terms. What happened next is the part of the story that the legend, in its way, is groping toward, because something really was taken, and it really was done in documents, and the documents really are boring enough that almost nobody reads them. In 1887, Congress passed the General Allotment Act, usually called the Dawes Act, after Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, and it did one thing with enormous consequences. It broke communal tribal landholding into individual parcels. Each enrolled member of a tribe would receive an allotment, typically a quarter section or less, and whatever remained after everyone was served would be declared surplus and open to non-Indian settlement. The public argument for it was civilizational. Communal ownership, the reformers said, held Indians in a backward condition, and private property would make them into farmers and citizens. Dawes himself is supposed to have said, after visiting the Cherokee Nation and finding no poverty and no debt, that the trouble with them was that they held their land in common and therefore had no selfishness, which is at the bottom of civilization. Whether or not the phrasing is exact, the sentiment is documented across the reform literature of the period, and I want you to hear it clearly, because it is the same sentence as the removal promise turned inside out. In 1830, the government said this land is worthless, therefore keep it forever. In 1887, it said, your way of holding land is the problem, therefore give it up. The 5 tribes of the Indian Territory, including the Choctaw, were initially exempted from the Dawes Act. They had treaties, they had governments, they had, in the Choctaw case, coal. So in 1893, Congress created a commission specifically to deal with them, chaired by Dawes, and its assignment was to negotiate the end of communal title in the Indian Territory. The nations refused to negotiate. The commission kept coming. In 1896, Congress instructed it to make the tribal rolls whether the nations cooperated or not, and enrollment became its own long, ugly process of a federal clerk deciding who was and was not a citizen of a nation he did not belong to. Then in 1897 came the Atoka Agreement, negotiated with Choctaw and Chickasaw representatives under conditions in which the alternative was having terms imposed anyway, and in 1898 the Curtis Act, which imposed them regardless. Between them, these instruments did the following. They provided for the allotment of the Choctaw and Chickasaw domain to individual citizens. They abolished the tribal courts. They stripped the tribal governments of most functioning authority and set a date for their dissolution. And they carved out, from the general allotment, a special category of land. Roughly 445,000 acres of coal and asphalt-bearing land were segregated, not allotted to citizens, not open to homesteaders, held apart, in trust, under federal administration, to be leased and eventually sold with the proceeds going to the Choctaw and Chickasaw peoples. Read that again and notice what it accomplishes. Every other acre of the nation goes into private hands, most of it eventually into non-Indian hands, through a machinery I will describe in a moment. The valuable acres, the ones with the coking coal, come out of tribal control and into federal control, with a promise of payment later. The nation's own government, which had been collecting royalties and spending them on schools, is dissolved. The royalty flow does not stop. It changes hands. The asphalt is worth its own sentence. Southeastern Oklahoma has natural asphaltic sandstone, rock impregnated with heavy bitumen, and in the 1890s that was a paving material. It was quarried and shipped and laid down in the streets of growing cities. So the same ridges that had been valued for the fuel that moved trains were now also valued for the surface that would carry automobiles, two eras of American movement priced out of the same folds of rock, both of them segregated into federal trust in the same act. Now, the allotment machinery, because this is where the general population of the Choctaw Nation was separated from the ground. An allotment came with restrictions on alienation. You could not immediately sell it. That was the protection. Over the following years, Congress and the Interior Department repeatedly loosened those restrictions, and around each loosening grew an industry. Guardianships were the core of it. A minor or a person declared incompetent had to have a guardian appointed by a probate court to manage the property, and the probate courts of eastern Oklahoma became, in the first decades of the 20th century, machines for transferring land. Guardians charged fees. Guardians sold timber and leased minerals to associates. Guardians sold the land itself at prices that the record shows were frequently a fraction of value. There were guardians who held dozens of wards. There were attorneys and bankers and county officials whose fortunes date precisely from this period and this practice. The historian who documented this in the most unanswerable detail was Angie Dabo. She was an Oklahoma scholar, and her book And Still the Waters Run traced the dispossession of the 5 tribes through the allotment process using land records, court files, and federal reports, and she named names because the names were in the documents. The University of Oklahoma Press declined to publish it on the understanding that the people described were living and prominent and litigious. It was published in 1940 by Princeton, after years of difficulty, and Dabo spent much of her career outside the academic positions her work should have earned her. I raise this because it is the closest thing in the real record to what the legend claims. A document about the taking of that country genuinely was suppressed, or near enough. It was not an ethnologist's notebook about hollow ridges. It was a historian's account of how the surface and the minerals were separated from their owners by probate, and the suppression was not mysterious. It was ordinary professional cowardice in the face of local power, and it failed because the book exists and you can buy it. That is the pattern I keep running into in this work. The concealment is real, and the concealment is boring. It is not a vault. It is a press declining a manuscript, a county judge approving a sale, a filing fee, a delay. Oklahoma became a state in 1907. The Indian Territory and the Oklahoma Territory were joined and admitted together, and the promise of 1,830 that no territory or state would be erected over that country without Choctaw consent ended without ceremony. The tribal governments had been scheduled for dissolution in 1906 and were extended in a diminished form, with principal chiefs appointed by the President of the United States rather than elected by the people, a condition that lasted for decades. For much of the 20th century, the Choctaw Nation's chief executive was a federal appointee, and the nation existed on paper as a legal entity for the purpose of settling accounts, and the segregated coal and asphalt lands sat in trust. Here is where the arithmetic becomes the story. The whole justification for segregating those acres was that they were too valuable to allot and should be sold for the benefit of the Choctaw and Chickasaw people. So the question is when they were sold and for how much. They were not sold promptly. Sales were authorized and postponed and reauthorized across decades. Congress legislated, the Interior Department administered, offers came in and were rejected as too low or accepted in part. Meanwhile, the underlying value was doing what value does when nobody is allowed to act on it. It aged. The coking coal of southeastern Oklahoma had a specific market window. It was valuable when American steel needed Western coke and before the industry consolidated around better and cheaper sources, and it was valuable when railroads burned coal in their own locomotives, which they did until the diesel-electric locomotive displaced steam across American railroading in the 1940s and 1950s. The mines that had made the Choctaw treasury rich were in decline by the 1920s. Many closed. The The great labour battles of the field were fought over a shrinking prize. By the time the segregated lands were finally being disposed of and judgment funds distributed, the asset that had justified taking them out of tribal hands in the first place was substantially worthless. You can argue about intent forever and you will not settle it. But you do not need intent for the outcome to be a taking. Land was removed from the control of its owners on the grounds that it was too valuable for them to manage, held by the manager for a working lifetime, and returned as money after the value had gone out of it. If a bank did that with your savings, you would not need to prove malice to know you had been robbed. The delay is the instrument. Now let us go back into the ridges, because they are still hollow, and they are doing what hollow ridges do. When you remove 11 or 12 feet of coal from under a hillside, and then drop the roof deliberately on your way out, the effects do not stop at the mine. They work upward, over years and decades. This is subsidence. The overlying rock settles into the void, fractures propagate toward the surface, and eventually the surface itself sags or cracks or drops. Foundations split, fences go out of line. Wells go dry because the fracturing has drained the shallow water table into the workings below. Roads develop dips that no amount of asphalt fixes because the ground under them is still finding its level. Southeastern Oklahoma has this. So do the coal counties of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and everywhere else the same method was used. And in most of those places, the ownership of the surface and the ownership of the minerals had been separated into different deeds decades earlier, so that the person whose house is cracking does not own the void that is cracking it and has no claim on the company that made it. And in many jurisdictions, the mineral deed carried an explicit right to let the surface subside. There are also fires. Abandoned coal workings admit air. Coal oxidizes and can heat and, given the right conditions, ignite, and once a seam is burning underground, there is often no practical way to put it out, because you cannot reach it and you cannot starve it of air without sealing an unmappable network of collapsed passages. Oklahoma has had underground coal fires. So has Pennsylvania, famously, where a town was eventually condemned and emptied around one. These fires can burn for decades, and in some documented cases for centuries. And there is the water. Rain and groundwater move through abandoned workings and reach exposed pyrite in the coal and the surrounding rock. Pyrite plus water plus oxygen produces sulfuric acid and dissolved iron. That water finds its way out of an old portal or up through a subsidence crack, and it runs into the creek, and it stains the stream bed, a rust orange that is unmistakable once you have seen it. Acid mine drainage kills the aquatic life in the receiving stream, and it does not stop when the mine closes. It gets worse. Treating it costs money forever, and the entity that made the problem has usually been dissolved for 50 years. So the ridges of the old Choctaw coalfield really are hollow. They really do contain rooms and passages laid out in something like streets. They really do sometimes swallow the ground above them, and they really do sometimes burn from within, and they really do bleed a strange coloured water into the creeks. Every single element of the legend is physically present in that landscape. The legend simply got the century wrong, and the builders wrong, and, most importantly, the motive wrong, because the story about a lost race that hollowed the ridges before the Choctaw arrived does something very specific. It moves the interesting history backward, out of reach, into a period with no records and no defendants. It says the remarkable thing about this ground happened long ago and was done by people who are gone and whose descendants make no claims. And the ground it says this about is ground that was taken from people who are still there. That is not an accident of the genre. It is the oldest move in the American story about American ground. The mound builder myth did it in the 1830s, precisely when removal needed it. The story about a vanished white civilization in the copper country of Michigan did it in the 1840s, when the treaty that ceded those mineral rights was fresh. The story about ancient Old World tunnels under the Grand Canyon did it in 1909, in the middle of the decade when that canyon was being converted from open country into a fenced federal asset with a railroad hotel at the rim, in every case the same trick. Somebody magnificent was here before, and they are gone, and therefore the question of who is here now is less urgent than it looks. I do not think the people who share these stories today are running that play consciously. I think they are responding to a real and correct instinct, which is that they are standing on ground with a hidden history and that somebody has an interest in them not looking too closely. That instinct is sound. It is aimed 1 century and 1 people off target. Now I want to give the legend its strongest version, because I do not think you argue honestly with the weak one. The strongest version is not that a lost race carved rooms under the Wachitas. The strongest version is this. The Choctaw, who were removed to that country in the 1830s, came from a homeland with a deep tradition about the ground itself, about the earth as origin and as ancestor. They arrived in a new country and lived on it for a generation and learned it, its water, its stone, its game. And then within a lifetime they watched outsiders open that ground and empty it and take the proceeds through law. If a Choctaw elder in the 1880s had said something to an ethnologist about the ridges being hollow and about what is under them belonging to a time before, that would not have been a report about tunnels. It would have been a statement about what the land is and what is being done to it. And the process that took the coal also did its best to make sure that such a statement, if it were made, would be understood by the listener as folklore rather than as testimony. That version I have some sympathy for, and it does not require a hidden document. It requires you to notice that the Bureau of Ethnology sat inside the same government that ran the Dawes Commission. Powell, who founded the Bureau, was simultaneously director of the Geological Survey. The same institution mapped what was under the ground and classified who was standing on it. Those are not separate activities. A survey is a price list. A tribal classification is a schedule of what claims will be honoured. Mooney himself, whatever his personal sympathies, and they were real, was writing for an agency whose findings had legal weight in exactly the matters that determined whether people kept their land. But sympathy is not evidence, and I am not going to hand you a fabricated quotation from a Choctaw elder to make a point land harder. Nobody has produced that testimony, and inventing it would be doing to those elders exactly what the patent medicine shows and the Wild West exhibitions did, which is putting words in native mouths because the words sell. What we do have, in quantity, is the other record. Council minutes, royalty accounts, the Choctaw Nation's own laws about coal leases, the rolls, the probate files, Debo's citations, the reports of federal inspectors, the disaster inquests. That record is enormous, and almost none of it is behind a wall. Which brings me to the last turn in this story, and it is the one I did not expect when I started pulling on it, because it runs the other direction. The Choctaw Nation was not extinguished. It was diminished for most of the 20th century. The government was hollowed out the way the ridges were, its authority robbed like pillars, its chief appointed from Washington. In the 1960s there was a serious federal proposal to terminate the nation's status altogether and liquidate the remaining assets, and it was passed and then repealed after Choctaw people organized against it. Elections for principal chief were restored in 1971. The first in more than 60 years. A new constitution came in the 1980s. The nation rebuilt a government, a court system, a health system, schools, and an economy across its historic territory in southeastern Oklahoma, and it is today one of the largest tribal nations in the United States by enrolled membership. And in 2020, the Supreme Court of the United States decided McGirt versus Oklahoma. The case was about criminal jurisdiction, and it concerned the Muskogee Nation, and the question the court had to answer was whether the Muskogee Reservation had ever been formally disestablished by Congress. The court said it had not. Allotment, the dissolution of tribal governments, statehood, a century of everyone assuming otherwise, none of it added up to disestablishment, because Congress had never said the words, and only Congress can say them. The reservation was still there. It had been there the whole time. The reasoning applied directly to the other nations of the Indian Territory, and the Choctaw reservation boundaries were subsequently recognized on the same grounds. There has been litigation and negotiation about the consequences ever since, and there will be for years. But the finding itself is the thing I want you to hold next to the legend. For 100 years the maps did not show that reservation. Everyone involved, including the state, including most of the lawyers, including the school books, treated it as gone, and it was never gone. It was unmarked. The line was still in the statute the entire time, and the only thing that had happened was that nobody drew it. That is a hidden thing in the ground, and it is a real one, and it turns out to be a boundary rather than a chamber. Let me put the whole shape of it together now, because the pieces only mean something in sequence. A people are told the land they are being moved to is worthless, and that promise of worthlessness is what makes the promise of permanence affordable. They accept it under duress, and they bury a large number of their people on the road. They rebuild on the new ground and hold it in common, which means that when the ground turns out to be worth an enormous amount, the entire nation is the landlord rather than a handful of individuals. A trader marries into citizenship and opens the coal. A railroad arrives and makes the coal salable. For 25 years the nation collects a royalty on its own body and pays for its own schools with it, which is the anomaly, the thing that almost never happens. Then the arrangement is unwound in law. Communal title is broken into individual allotments, which are then loosened out of native hands through probate at a scale that took a historian's career to document and a publisher's nerve to print. The coal and asphalt acres are carved out and held in federal trust on the reasoning that they are too valuable to be trusted to their owners, and they are held so long that they cease to be valuable, and then the accounts are settled in a currency that has been quietly discounted by time. The tribal government is dissolved, then reduced to a federally appointed chief. The state is erected over the country in defiance of the promise, and the promise is not repealed, only ignored, which is why it was still there in 2020 when someone finally read it out loud in a courtroom. Meanwhile, physically, the ridges are emptied by men who are paid in money that spends in one store, whose pillars are robbed on the way out so that the mountain settles behind them, roughly 100 of whom die in a single morning at Krebs in 1892, and whose descendants live above ground that cracks and burns and bleeds orange water into the creeks a century later, with the liability for it attached to companies that no longer exist. Now hold the legend up against that. The legend says there is an unpublished document from the 1880s about hollow ridges. The record says there are thousands of published documents from the 1890s about how the ridges were emptied and who was paid. The legend says the truth is being withheld by an agency. The record says the truth was printed in the Statutes at Large, which is the least secret publication in the United States, and that almost nobody has ever read it because reading it is dull. That is the real concealment technology, and it is not a vault, it is tedium. You can hide a great deal inside a document that a normal person will not finish. You can hide a whole coal field inside a subsection about the segregation of certain lands. Nobody classified it. They simply relied, correctly, on the fact that 120 years later the exciting story would be about a lost race and not about a schedule of acreage. I said earlier that this is not a debunking video, and I meant it, so let me be precise about what I think survives. The instinct that the ground you live on has a history somebody would rather you not examine is correct. The instinct that there is a document is correct, though there are thousands of them and they are open. The instinct that a great deal was taken and that the taking was disguised is correct. The instinct that the disguise was official is correct. The only thing that is wrong is the date and the cast, and the wrongness of those two things is not neutral, because moving the story back into prehistory and giving it to a vanished people is precisely what makes it safe to tell. Nobody has to answer for the lost race. There is no counterparty. There is no county in Oklahoma where a probate file is still on the shelf with a name in it. So here is what I would rather you do than repost the Mooney story. Find the ridges nearest to you. Almost everyone listening to this lives within a reasonable drive of ground that has been mined, quarried, drilled, logged, dammed, or condemned. Then go find 4 things. Find out what came out of it, and when the last of it came out. That is usually in a state geological survey publication or a county history, and it is usually free. Find out who held the surface and who held the minerals, because in a great many places those are 2 different deeds, and the split is where the interesting arithmetic lives. If the deed to the ground under your feet reserves the minerals to somebody else, you are living on the same arrangement I have been describing, in miniature. Find out who was there before the survey, and what document moved them, and what that document called the moving. The word chosen matters: cession, purchase, agreement, relinquishment. The vocabulary of these instruments is a study in itself, and the euphemism is almost always the tell. And find out what is still owed and to whom, because in a surprising number of these cases the answer is not nothing. Trust accounting cases, judgment funds, unreclaimed mine liability, water treatment obligations. The ledger is frequently still open. One more thing before the payoff, because I skipped past it and it deserves its own moment. The coal towns themselves are gone, or nearly. Krebs, Hartshorn, Wilburton, Coalgate, Lehigh, Alderson, Gowan, Dow. Some of them are still on the map as small towns with a few hundred people and a fine Italian restaurant or two. Others are names on a county highway sign with a cemetery behind it and nothing else. At their peak, these places held tens of thousands of people who had come from Calabria and Carmarthenshire and Lithuania and Mississippi to work a seam under an Oklahoma ridge, and they built union halls and lodges and churches and bandstands, and within 2 generations most of that was gone, because the seam was worked out and the railroads went diesel and there was nothing else the ground had been asked to produce. That is worth noticing on its own terms. A place gets built to empty a hill, and when the hill is empty, the place is surplus, and the people scatter to Tulsa and Dallas and the Detroit assembly lines. Then, 30 or 40 years later, somebody drives through and finds a half-emptied town on the edge of a hollow ridge with an old portal grown over in the trees, and it looks for all the world like the aftermath of something catastrophic and unexplained. There is a real vanished civilization at the base of those hills. It is not older than the Choctaw. It is younger than the automobile, and it kept records, and the records say that it was assembled deliberately and abandoned on schedule the moment the arithmetic turned. And that is the pattern in miniature, which is why I keep circling back to it. Nothing about that valley was hidden. Every stage of it was announced in advance, budgeted, surveyed, and reported to shareholders, and the only thing that ever went missing was the attention of the people who came afterward. Emptiness reads as mystery to anyone who arrives late enough, and arriving late is the ordinary human condition, and there is an entire industry that exists to sell you a stranger explanation for a silence that is fully accounted for in the county clerk's office a few miles further up the road from where you stand. You will not find a lost race. I have been doing this a long time, and I have never found one, and neither has anybody else, and the reason is not that the evidence has been suppressed. The reason is that the thing people are actually sensing when they look at an uncanny landscape is not an older civilization, it is an older transaction. We are surface creatures. We are built to be uneasy about what is underneath us, and a hollow hill genuinely does something to the nervous system that a solid one does not. When that unease has no explanation attached to it, the mind supplies one, and the mind prefers a builder to an accountant, because a builder is a story and an accountant is a form. But when you go and look, every time, at the bottom of the hollow you find a form, a lease, a royalty schedule, a per-ton rate, a guardianship approved on a Tuesday, a section of an act with a number on it, segregating 445,000 acres of coal and asphalt from the people who owned them, on the stated grounds that those people could not be trusted with the value. The Choctaw are still in that country. They run hospitals and schools and courts there, and the reservation the maps forgot is back on the maps. The ridges are still hollow, and some of them are still burning, and the creeks in a few places still run the wrong colour, and none of that is a mystery, and all of it has a name attached to it in a public file. Nobody needs James Mooney's missing notebook. The record we already have is heavier than any notebook, and it has this advantage over a legend, which is that you can check it. Go and check it, then make of that what you will.